Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. This week I got another roundup post for you, generally summarizing the month of October. These are all albums I've been listening to for the past 3 or 4 weeks, and this is just meant to be sort of superficial ideas and some few things about the albums. Nothing too deep right now, hopefully with the intent of either encouraging you to go check these albums out or maybe coming back to do a more dedicated post on them soon, okay? So we got 6 albums though, so let's go and get started. The first one is Arlo Parks, Collapsed in Sunbeams. Great disc. I really discovered here at the last minute very recently, viewer suggestion. And it's a debut album from this British London-based singer-songwriter. Her voice, her vocal tone is very along the lines of kind of R&B standards. But she sings kind of a little bit more in a indie rock songwriter pop style. So it's a cool space between these two genres of music. And I gotta say that her voice is beautiful. Her songs are extremely well written with a lot of great harmonic support and wonderful melodies that are super easy to remember. You will listen to this album once and probably walk away seeing some of the tunes on it. It's very impressive in its accessibility, but still never really gives up a real sense of honesty and authenticity.
Hold my hand in public, felt the eyes judging our love and baying for blood. I could never blame you, darling. Some of these folks wanna make you cry, but you gotta trust how you feel inside and shine, yeah.
The Collapse of Sunbeams for a debut album has gotten quite a bit of critical acclaim, and I think that's really warranted in this case. It's about a 40-minute album. It goes by quick, and it's only because so many of the songs are so engaging. You realize that, oh, this is my favorite song on the album. Oh, this is my favorite song on the album. Oh, this is my favorite song on the album. And then you get to the end. So it goes by quickly because it's an enjoyable experience to listen to the album. It goes down easy, but at the same time, it's not pandering to the listener. It's very heartfelt and very confessional in some ways. So the topics that she talks about are things that are very personal. So a great album, the one that you should definitely check out, and one that's causing some real problems this late in the year with the top 20, because this is one that really probably stands out with some of the best albums that I've listened to this year. Okay, next up is Gaspard Auge, Escapades album. Gaspard Auge is a synthesizer player and musician that's one part of a band called Justice. He's French-based. Clearly from the name is a kind of a giveaway on that one. And this album is interesting because it is it's a synth album that's very, very retro in its approach. And I've been sort of struggling with this idea about what retro is and what nostalgia is. In this case, I feel like Escapades is more retro than nostalgia because he really goes to great lengths to recapture the sounds and the feel of 70s synthesizer rock music. I mean, think about like Giorgio Moroder, Jean-Michel Jarre, and maybe even a little bit of ABBA, like without the pop songwriting, just straight ahead instrumental aspects of ABBA would be another one. And just those examples you have that there, it gives you this feel that it's sort of a disco sense to the album, but also kind of prog rocky, kind of prog rock disco. There's a lot of really incredibly musical things that happen on Escapades. There's great melodies. There's a lot of attention to detail if you're talking about trying to recapture the sounds of the 70s. But the problem that really I see with this album, even though it's really super enjoyable, to be honest, is that it follows very directly in the steps, perhaps, of Jean-Michel Jarre. This is the first one that comes to my mind, especially as a person. Gaspard is a French musician. He's got to have some sort of awareness of Jean-Michel Jarre's music, if not some influence there. And the problem with following Jean-Michel Jarre and that style of music too closely is that Jean-Michel Jarre, as much as I love him, was kind of dorky sometimes. He was a little bit cliche and goofy. Although he came up with some great thematic work, he's done amazing things, and he was a huge innovator on the synthesizer. He was not above being a little bit goofy sometimes. And I think that sometimes Escapades veers into that territory, whether it's intentional or not is hard to discern. But it kind of mars the overall experience of the album. I mean, if you listen to that track back there, Hey, it's going along really great. There's a lot of fun stuff on it, but then he puts in the word hey, and it sounds like a cat's coughing up a hairball, you know? And I get the sense that this sort of almost self-effacing quality of the music is intentional, especially if you look at the video. I mean, you got some kind of Mongolian warlord like going across the plains while he's playing a violin. That's pretty over the top, and I think that over the top is a good way to think about Gaspard Auge's Escapades. As great as it is, it definitely is a little bit over the top in times. And speaking of over the top, next one up is Hans Zimmer's Dune OST, the original soundtrack to Dune. Hans Zimmer is always an interesting one because he has produced some of the most amazing soundtracks in the last 10 years of anybody that you can think of, you know. But specifically since The Dark Knight going forward, he has been trying to bury melody more and more and rely more and more on texture and ambience and timbre to get the effects out of the music that he's looking for. And I think this really comes to a head in Dune. Now, I love Dune. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And I'm looking forward to seeing this movie. And I've always wanted a soundtrack that really represented that book well, to the point where I watched the movie Jodorowsky's Dune, that documentary on the making of Jodorowsky's version of Dune, and kind of accepted that as a canonical soundtrack. So I'm hungry for a great Dune soundtrack, and by and large, I think that Hans Zimmer delivers on this one. The thing that makes this soundtrack a little bit opaque, a little bit hard to get to as a freestanding piece of music, is that as far as Zimmer's quest to bear down and really make the most of texture and a variety of non-orchestral sounds, this is the most pronounced version of that I think that he's ever created. A lot of the sounds I get on this one are sort of like, this is back to Man of Steel, which is one of my favorite Zimmer soundtracks, actually. That soundtrack had this aspect of very otherworldly. Every time the Kryptonian themes come up, there'll be this sort of otherworldly alien sounds. That's the basis for the entire Dune soundtrack. They're all very textural, and melodies are very buried. So initially, this one was like kind of a letdown, but Hans Zimmer always seems to somehow make it work to where after I've listened to it several times and start to peel away the layers, finding melodic material in there that helps. This isn't the kind of soundtrack that, you know, people are going to be going to play this on the marching band field, or there's not going to be a good orchestral arrangement of this music because many of these sounds just don't exist in the real world, or they're from instruments that are so distinctive and uncommon that they just wouldn't show up. You'd have to do some kind of different way of arranging it. So that falls out of my normal conception of a soundtrack, my root fundamental idea what a soundtrack is. But this is a really good one, and it's one that's grown on me more and more, and I'm really excited to see it in context of the movie. I think that when I see it in the context of the movie, it'll probably pop into place like the Interstellar soundtrack did a few years ago. So Hans Zimmer's Dune OST is a great one to check out, I think, and especially I like to check it out before I see the movie so that I know what I'm listening for before I see it. Okay, next one up is Weezer's OK Human. During 2020, we're in lockdown. Going into it anyway, Rivers Cuomo from Weezer had been kind of thinking about working on making this album that was kind of a digression for Weezer in that it was going to incorporate a full orchestra. And if you know anything about Weezer, like in their roots of being kind of a grungy, messy, loud guitar band, that seems a little bit incongruous. I'm also a person, because of Weezer's back catalog and the spotty nature of a lot of their albums, I don't automatically go buy a new Weezer album until I do a little bit of research on it. And I tend to also believe critics when they say a Weezer album isn't so great. But this particular album, all the critics were saying, like, hey, this is actually one of the good ones. This is one that compares to some of Weezer's best work. So the reluctant critical acclaim that was associated with this album caused me to go ahead and hunker down and get it. And I will say that, for me personally, this is one of the best, like probably a top Weezer album in their catalog.
Walking down the road.
Now, when you describe an orchestral Weezer album, that just sounds like it's not going to work, But I will tell you that I think that Rivers Cuomo was particularly inspired in the making of this album. He feels more invested and genuine in the way that he's approaching it. He's playing keyboards a lot on this album. The video, you see a lot of him playing not standard Weezer instruments. So not only is the music of a high quality standard, but also Rivers Cuomo's lyrics, which sometimes border on the hokey, are really on point on this album. I think it's really a great outing for Weezer, and a surprise favorite of mine from this last year. I kind of thought that I'd listen to this and be like, well, okay, it's another Weezer album, but it really is something to check out. Especially if you're a Weezer fan that's kind of on the fence. I think it's worth a close look. Okay, next up is the Armed Ultrapop. The Armed is like this large post-rock group and a contemporary post-punk band. I feel like has to have this sort of electronic edge. It has the sense that it's sort of a processed and compressed and just overblown in the studio to the point where it's like out of control big. That's what the Armed has got going on here. Its energy is kind of punk and post-punk, but the sound almost feels like a shoegaze album, where the prominence of the guitars and the instruments almost like buries the vocals inside. And like shoegaze, this relationship of like overblown instrumentation and buried vocals kind of gives the sense that the listener is sort of buried or almost overflowing with the energy of the instrumentation, to where the lyrics and everything else are secondary to the sense of catharsis that goes along with it. And I definitely get that from the Armed too. There's a joyful exuberance to this album that belies its sort of aggressive nature. What I've been thinking about a lot as I've been listening to Ultrapop is sort of the sad fate of the band Jesus Jones and that whole vein of music that kind of got dropped in the early 90s when Nirvana came along. What's actually finally happening now is you're starting to see punk bands understand how to use synthesis and that style of that soundscape in that setting. It doesn't really sound industrial, which is what was happening in the early 90s, but there was this sense of like synth pop evolving into something that had a very more aggressive, intense tone to it. And that's kind of the thing that Jesus Jones had going on. And they got kind of walked on Nirvana whenever those guys showed up. But just now, I feel like that those guys are really forward-looking, or finally now people are getting it. The Armed is the kind of group that kind of puts that together. And I like to compare them a little bit to Jesus Jones, but really if you're a fan of Andrew WK and like Mew with some pretty aggressive vocals, you'd really probably dig this album. I really like the Mew components of this quite a bit. When it gets really aggressive and loud, sometimes it's kind of hard to swallow, but it's still enjoyable to listen to, and it doesn't break the continuity of the disc at all. So the highest points of this album are fantastic, and the parts that aren't quite so high are still really fun and energetic to experience and listen to. Okay, finally I've got TEKE, Shirushi, slightly wacky but really earnest alt-rock group that mixes Japanese elements with rock. It's got a lot of straight-ahead rock with kind of surf overtones with it, but also like strong pentatonic work, kind of shakuhachi influenced flute playing. There's a dedicated flute player of the grand, and she's got a really good grip on how to copy shakuhachi sounds on a chromatic flute, which is pretty cool actually. This melding of these different styles in a very kind of alt-rock sense really plops this in the sound field of like a Quentin Tarantino soundtrack. Any track on this album would not be out of place on the soundtrack of Kill Bill. Very often, Japanese rock crossover things can kind of come off as a little bit almost like dorky, like maybe this cast off anime titles that nobody used. But I think that this album has a degree of conviction that elevates it quite a bit above a lot of that other kind of stuff. So I think TEKE's approach on this album is very believable, and it sells. I think overall the album is a fun listen. It borders on some noisy stuff from time to time and gets a little bit, chaotic, but it's a fun listen, and its cross-cultural elements, I think, are particularly interesting in how they play out in the formation of the music on Shirushi. So an album worth checking out for sure. And that's all I got for you guys this week. So I would go check out all these groups at your own pace. Support the artist. Go to Bandcamp and buy from those guys. That's the best deal for artists overall there. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and then share it out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I'm going to be putting tracks up from these 6 albums over there. And also be on the lookout. I'm working through my end of year top 20 bracket eliminations week by week. So keep your eyes open for that. And until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.